and I'd like to welcome you to this event this afternoon. This is being held in conjunction with the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame, which was established by the University of Georgia Libraries in 2000 to honor Georgia's writers. The Hall of Fame is administered by the Harvard Red Book and Manuscript Library, which is home to the Georgiana Collection, which is the most extensive collection of materials written by Georgians or about Georgia in the world. The annual exhibit that honors the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame winners is currently on display in the Harvard Library. In the first year, back in 2000, we inducted 12 authors, and since that time, 17 additional authors have been honored, including 3 of the authors who make up our panel today, Terry Kay, Dr. John Stone, Dr. Farrell Sams, and then we're also pleased to welcome our newest inductee, Bailey White, who will join the panel, will join the Hall of Fame tomorrow at our informal induction ceremony, which will be held at the top floor of the Student Learning Center at 10:30. Our moderator this afternoon is Professor Hubert McAlexander from the university's English department. And because our time is short, I'm not going to introduce each of the panelists. I would instead refer you to the program. I would ask you, though, I think you can probably tell we're going to be recording this, so please turn off your cell phones. And you were given a card as you entered the auditorium. If you have a question for one of the authors, please write it on your note card and we'll begin collecting those during the program. And now it's my pleasure to turn things over to our moderator, Professor McAlexander.
Thank you. I want to ask you all some questions. I'm going to focus primarily on reading. And Bailey, could I begin with you?
You may.
How did reading make you a writer?
My father was a writer. And when I was a little girl, my mother would read my father's books to us children. And then I became a writer. I have a cousin, Lily King, who became a writer, and my brother became a writer. So I think writing is a congenital condition in my family. But my mother did read those books to us at an early age, and my father wrote really good children's books. And I think that may have given us all the idea that writing was something that could be done for a living.
Very interesting, eh? Farrell?
My mother read us the story of the Bible, and my father drank an awful lot of white liquor. And this gives you a great background for writing.
Don't say that, because that's what my students think all the time, that writers just get real tanked up, and then they write. Tanked up, and then they write. And I have to tell them, no, that's not correct. So, Terry?
The question is, how did reading help me as a writer?
How did it help make you?
Help make me a writer? Plagiarism. That's it. And I'm telling you the absolute truth. I learned to write, and I've said this a zillion times, I learned to write in the Atlanta Journal sports department in the early 60s by taking Furman Fisher's columns every day and retyping them until I got a sense of the field of language that he used. And it is still, in my estimation, the finest exercise anybody who wants to write can do, is to copy a really good book. When you finish that book, you'll be a far better writer than you were when you started. But it's true. Reading, of course, my God. You learn when you read, and it's just a natural process. I don't know of anybody who can write who doesn't read.
John?
I think we could do worse than to emulate Emily Dickinson on this question, who said, my father gives me dozens, hundreds of books, then begs me not to read them. He wanted to keep her pure and innocent, but she, of course, was not destined to become pure and innocent. I think a lot of writers have been inoculated by listening to the written word. I certainly was. And my brother, who's a couple of years younger than I, I used to read when he and I would go to the movies until he said, "I'm 12 now, you don't have to read anymore." But I think it's a very good exercise for learning to speak the language.
Well, you're the poet in the bunch. What about influence of reading on poetry, or is that the major influence?
Well, poetry is it's a specialty skill. But the children who are lucky get read rhymes from nursery rhymes, and words stick to them. Just can't get them off. It's very important that they learn from their parents or from a relative or someone who knows them well, so you can explain what a word means, how subtleties are different among the words. There's one other thing I was going to say, but I forgot.
Well, you may remember it in a minute. Farrell, we have two medical men here. How did your reading influence you as a doctor?
Oh, if you couldn't read, don't go into medicine. On old Olympus, towering top of Finn and Russian, viewed some hops. You remember that one? That's the cranial nerves.
What, Terry, was the most intense reading period in your life? Was there a period in your life when you read more than any other?
There was one semester that I spent at Wofford College in Spartanburg, South Carolina, where I read 20 hours out of 24. I swear, it was the hardest experience, academic experience I've ever been involved in, and which is probably the reason I transferred from Wofford to LaGrange College. I didn't have to read as much. But no, I really enjoyed reading when I was young. Again, like experiences that would be shared here. We didn't have electricity when I was growing up, so obviously we didn't have television. The radio was played rarely because it was battery operated, and we read. I grew up in a large family, I'm the 11th of 12 children. And fortunately, my parents read and my siblings read. So I thought it was just sort of a natural thing to do, normal, the way we live. I didn't know people didn't read until I got to high school. And I got to high school and started playing football and realized there were members of my team that hadn't read a lot. So, I think childhood was the most intense.
Bailey, what was the most intense reading period in your life?
I think it was when I read Gone with the Wind when I was 12 years old, and it was the first book where I understood that expression, you can't put it down.
John, what about you?
I tend to read in cycles. I go on Emily Dickinson for a while and read biographies and letters. Same for Faulkner. Same for Whitman. Same for any of a number of poets. I've recently been rereading Richard Wilbur because he was in town, and he's our greatest, I think, greatest living formalist poet. He's so wonderful. So I like to read and then commit to memory. I think that's very important for poets. But I happen to know members of this panel also memorize poetry. And it's one of the things that ought to begin quite early. My granddaughter, who lives in Boston now, is 12 years old. And the last time we saw each other, I taught her a famous poem by Robert Frost. Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, and so forth. And she just memorize it instantly. And I think that's what happens with languages and with great poems.
Farrell, tell us everything you memorized on Route 3.
Everything?
Yes.
You want me to recite it now?
Well, I don't know, but maybe intermittently.
Well, you had to memorize when I went to school. Small school, teacher had a whip. It looked like a fishing pole, but it was a whip. And you had to memorize. And when I saw what happened to the boys who didn't, I memorized. And it really came pretty easily to me, especially if it rhymes. And Golly Martin, you go through different phases of what you like and what you don't like. Browning is difficult to memorize, but it can be done, and it's very gratifying once you've accomplished it. Malay is very easy to memorize, and it's very gratifying while you were doing it. I think John Stone and I both are a little frustrated because we did not come under her spell personally. I would love to have been 10 years older and have met her.
When do you read now, Terry?
Excuse me.
When do you read now?
When?
When?
Oh, I read at night, mainly. I don't read as much now as I used to, primarily because my eyesight is not as good as it used to be. But the other thing I learned a long time ago is it is impossible for me to read fiction when I'm writing fiction. I'd much rather read poetry. I'd much rather read nonfiction. And it's not because I have any fear at all of stealing a character or stealing, as suggested earlier, plagiarizing language or anything. I am terrified of picking up the rhythm of a writer. And that, I think, is a dangerous thing to do if you're writing and you have your own voice and your own rhythm for that particular story. You do not want it to be ruined by another writer's rhythm. Had that happened to me once when I was working on a book, and I was frustrated one afternoon, and you got that point where you didn't know where to go. And so I was walking around, and I came to a desk where Pat Conroy's book was there, The Great Santini, which has always been my favorite of his books. Wonderful thing. And I opened it up, and just standing there and read about 3 pages. I went back an hour or so later to write, and I wrote the scene that I wrote that afternoon. When I finally sent the book in to the editor, I got a call from him saying, "How did I get Pat to write that passage?" And I said, "Pat didn't write the passage." "I did." He said, No, Pat wrote this." "No, he didn't. I wrote it." So I stubbornly said, "I'm not going to rewrite it. I like it like it is, and unless you order me to do it, it's going to be." So it was published that way. I had his ex-wife, his sister, and 2 or 3 other people asked me the same question. "How did you get Pat to write that section for you?" Simply because I had subconsciously picked up the rhythm. And so I don't read a lot of fiction when I'm writing. And right now I'm trying to do fiction, so I haven't read anything for
You can read mine, Helen won't call me.
Well, don't most writers realize at some point, oh, that came from such and such? That you do it without realizing, and then later it hits you. None of you have had that experience.
Could you be a little more explicit?
Well, I remember an interview with Walker Percy in which he was talking about Faulkner. And he said, no, I wasn't influenced by Faulkner. And he said, but every now and then I start writing and I think, oh God, I sound just like him. That's what I mean.
I haven't had.
If I sounded like Faulkner, I'd tear it up.
John?
I'm curious about from the fiction writer or nonfiction writer, if you read your material out loud after you've written it, as poets generally do.
Right.
Do you reread your material?
I usually read it out loud to myself.
Yeah.
I do it all the time,
Yeah.
yes. But again, I think.
I mean, it helps you get rid of extra words.
Yeah.
There are too many theories in my writing. You can do away with nearly all of them. Adverbs are poison. You have to be careful. But when you read it, you hear it. The eye is a very forgiving organ. The ear isn't.
Yeah.
I think, verily, we grew up on sound. You know, we grew up with radio and things. I didn't grow up
We
with
didn't have
television.
one.
Huh? Well, but you didn't have television, you didn't go to the movies every night like kids do today. I have talked with other writers about this who grew up in the era of television and went to movies a lot. And when they write, they don't hear a scene, they see it.
Yeah.
I never see a scene, I hear it always. Therefore, yes, I read aloud what I write. And it's got to
You
have.
don't
a
see what
right
you're
to-
writing to?
No, I don't.
Bailey, do you have a feeling about that?
Well, I write a lot of things that get put on the radio, and the most horrifying thing is when you hear yourself reading it on National Public Radio and realize you should have edited out a lot of varies, and it's too late.
Well, if it's in dialect, it's forgivable.
Mhm.
And if you put it in quotation marks, it's somebody else speaking, you can get away with murder. But I know what you mean. Reading your own work is sort of like reading your own work in public. It's sort of like an elephant giving himself an animal with his own trunk. It's difficult.
I've never seen an elephant do that.
Oh, but I keep hoping.
I think NPR would love an essay on that.
Well, Bailey, you have talked about reading Gone for Winter as the experience of it. Who is your favorite writer? I know that's an almost impossible question. Or do you want to do one or two or three?
I have several different favorites in different categories. My favorite garden writer is Thomas Christopher, and my favorite British writer is Anthony Trollope, and my favorite British woman writer is Barbara Pym. My favorite Southern writer is Farrell Sands.
Hey! I tell you what I think about Bailey White's writing tomorrow.
John, who's your favorite writer?
I would say in different categories, probably my overall favorite writer is E.B. White, because he is a minimalist of the highest order. He puts together the language like no one I've ever known. He can also write poetry, really quite distinguished enough to be in the New Yorker. I like Faulkner very much. I remember distinctly as I was growing up, he was persona non grata in Mississippi, which is where I'm from. And because of his feeling about racial matters, he was much more progressive than his neighbors, much more liberal. And I got out a book of his called As I Lay Dying. I'd read some short stories, The Bear and that sort of thing, but I got this novel called As I Lay Dying, and I was completely taken. It was funny and deep and skillful. I said to myself as a native Mississippian, thank God this man can write.
I read that and had exactly the opposite reaction.
Yeah, That's true for a lot of things.
I was not in Mississippi. I was in Normandy,
France?
in a tent hospital, and it was a paperback that the USO put out. And I had heard of him before. They didn't teach him at Mercer. He
Yeah.
wasn't a Baptist. And I picked it up and I read it. And when I finished it, I flung it across the tent instead of returning it to the Red Cross, because it made me feel so bad.
It did?
It made me feel awful.
Maybe you were depressed.
It would depress anybody. He bored a hole in the coffin and bored it into his mama's eyes. And the buzzards followed him.
Oh, yeah. And taking a broken bone and putting it in a keg of concrete.
Yeah.
Said it. Well, you have to understand humor in Mississippi.
I never thought of Faulkner as a humorist.
But
Georgia has a much higher
the
tone.
final person I really like is Chekhov. Not only was he a physician, but he was probably the world's most distinguished short story writer and playwright. And sometimes he just hits the nail on the head in terms of medicine, because he spent a lot of his life, 40 years old when he died, he spent a lot of his life fighting off plague and various poxes and writing. So he's an easy man to love.
What role has reading played in your being a doctor?
I didn't understand.
What role has reading played in your being a doctor, John?
I think that it's taught me to listen. And poetry is perhaps the best substrate on which to listen to patients, because if you take a 10-line poem or a 14-line sonnet and you figure up the statistical need to look at all the possible words, combinations, semicolon, you're ending up with 100,000 possibilities. And that's when you ask a patient, tell me about your chest pain, you're going to get a very complicated, idiosyncratic, very unique story. And I think that's one of the things that doctors and poets share it, and obviously novelists as well. They share a fascination with astonishing stories. So listening to the story is the most important thing a physician can do.
You realize, of course, that poetry is the aristocracy of the language. And this is true. And and I say this in all seriousness, nobody memorizes prose. They memorize poetry because it brings out feelings that you have not experienced before, or maybe that you have experienced before and no one else had. And John Stone is probably the nearest thing approaching genius on this platform. Have you read any of his poetry?
Yeah.
I always
Thank you,
believe
Sambo.
that poetry is a good poet is the perfect distillation of a good novel.
Of what?
A good novel. And I think that a good novel is the perfect extension of a good poet. I think that
The
poetry is...
distillation of a good novel.
Yeah,
What would you do with Gone with the Wind?
well, if anybody wants to attempt to put it in a poem, they certainly can. I don't know how.
I've never thought
I'm
of
not a
that
poet,
before.
so I don't know how to do that. But I honestly think what I was trying to do is address what you're saying is that it is kind of the ballet of the written word.
Well, look at our history. I mean, Bailey's the only one that's really and truly mentioned an old author here. She's Trollope is one of my favorites. But looking back over the years, you don't remember the prose writers. I mean, there are a lot more people who can identify with Milton than with Erasmus. But we've got Shakespeare, Chaucer, John Donne, all of these. And this is true in American lit too. I mean, we novelists come and we go and we die. But the poems live on much longer than the prose.
Can I just add excuse me, Sam. Can I just add one word about E.B. White, because he may seem an unusual addition to this panel, but he's such a capable writer, and he wrote a memorial for his wife, who died and did a lot of work on flowers and planting of flowers for the New Yorker, wrote books about it. And he said in his memorial to her, he said, I can still see her there on a dark October day in her old raincoat with the unlikely likelihood that she will be there in time to see the spring, but still sitting there calmly waiting for the resurrection. That hurts. That's so good.
Yeah.
It hurts. Calmly waiting for the resurrection as it comes at you and blindsides you. And that's what I like writing to do. It hurt me a bit. Hit me.
Bailey, I want to ask you this. First of all, I'll read this, you'll like it. It's addressed to you. Where have you been? I really miss hearing you on NPR. Come back.
What a nice comment.
Amen.
And here's the question for you. What makes you write?
I guess a deadline. That will bring it out.
Yeah. But when you started, especially, you didn't have any deadline.
No. I guess it's just the idea that you sometimes get that you have something you think you can say better than anybody else. And that feeling may be very brief and very inaccurate.
But in Bailey White's instance, it's very true.
I'm going to really switch it around. Terry, I'm so interested in the name of one of your books because I just heard it, not as the title of your book, but I just heard it this year, Dark 30. Is that just pervasively Georgia? Because the person I heard it from was from South Georgia, and you're not.
No, I think that's a phrase that's, I think it's a southern phrase, maybe even beyond the South. It's, when I started working on the book, it was an interesting thing. I wrote the first page one afternoon, and it was about 6 o'clock in the afternoon. I forget this. After hours from the place I was working, and one of the people I worked with came into my office to aggravate me more than anything else. And I said, yeah, we should leave, because I'm trying to get some writing done here. She said, I will leave if you will read me what you've written. And I'd only written about 5, 6 paragraphs. So I said, okay. I read those 5 paragraphs, and she said, oh, you're talking about Dark 30. And when she said that, I thought, yeah, I haven't heard that phrase in years, but that's exactly what it is. And it's the time 30 minutes after sundown before dark, or 30 minutes in the morning before sunrise comes up. Normally they refer to it as nighttime. But have you heard that phrase?
Not until I read your book.
Huh?
Not until I read your book.
I mean, that phrase,
Which I thought was one of your better
up with.
ones, by the way. I thought it was one of your better ones.
Thank you. It's the only one I've ever read of my own books.
Have you ever heard it, Bailey?
Yes, I have.
So, John and you?
Oh, I have.
Well, see, I hadn't either. John and I both grew up in Mississippi. But I'd never heard it until this student.
You gotta have humor to grow up in Mississippi, though. Is that right?
You have to have humor to grow up anywhere.
Anywhere, this is true. I'm surprised that it wouldn't be used in Mississippi.
Well, I was too. too.
Good.
Now, I've heard a funny expression in the place I live in, I don't think, bull bat time.
Bull that time.
Have you heard it?
Yeah, that's dark 30. It's after sundown and the bull bats are flying all around
Well,
the
you've
barn.
heard that.
Yeah. You've never seen a bull bat?
Oh, no, I've heard it. I just didn't, I was surprised
Now,
that.
that's a phrase I don't know.
Bailey?
No, I don't know bullbat time.
I'm scared of the little bats.
But you've
These
never,
are great big birds, and they're not real bats.
Oh, they're not?
But they call them bull bats. You've
right.
seen them?
Oh, yes, of course, right. Boy, what a thing.
Well, they've had benighted childhoods.
Well, but it means those bull bats are all around. You and I both have heard it. Well, I know that in the 19th century, I've read in old newspapers, it will begin at first candlelight. And I thought that was fascinating. That's 1830s, 1840s. Which is like dark 30 in a way. I mean, it's fairly specific. And then first dark, of course.
First candlelight is different from first dawn.
Go on.
My grandfather was a child of Reconstruction. He was born before the Civil War, but grew up in Reconstruction and married very young. He was 17. My grandmother was 16. They lived on adjacent farms. They called them planations in those days. And he went courting. And his future mother-in-law would always bring out a candle that had already been burned, had been lit. And he was supposed to leave when the candle went out. That was first candlelight. And he became obstinate at this aggressive behavior on the part of this lady. And he finally decided that he was going to stay one evening until she had to bring out a fresh candle. And he always talked about first candlelight. Romantic.
Great story.
He got the girl, by the way.
You're here, we knew that.
Yeah, that's right.
Living proof. How would you advise people today, this generation, what would you advise them about writing?
You talking to me?
Oh, anybody.
Hey,
Let me think a minute, you ain't.
we want to think about that a minute.
Oh, you do, okay, all right. Gary?
Well, I think we have to understand that we're living in a time that is so different than 5 years ago, 10 years ago. I held in my hand last week what I think is going to be the future of the book. It's about that high, about this wide, about this thick. It was leather bound, which really surprised me. I opened it up, and the guy showed it to me. It's produced by the Sony Corporation. Opened it up, and here's a screen. He had 150 books in this computer book thing. I think that's what's going to be read 10 years from now, 15 years from now. This thing, if you open it and say you want to read War and Peace, you got War and Peace, you push the button and it shows. It's 800 pages long. Well, click a thing and it turns the pages, etc. But if you say, I don't like the size of the font, I'm going to make it larger. This is going to be good for me, I can tell you. So you make it larger. And now it becomes 1,200 pages long. But it's okay. You flip the thing, it runs. If you come to a word you don't understand, you highlight it, go to the dictionary. Almost anything that you think about that you can do on a computer, you can do here. That's going to be a very big thing. Do you know that last year in Japan, well, they consider the novel, half the novels were written on cell telephones, text messaging. Half of them. And do you know how many novels, not novels, but how many books are published every day? This is 3,000 books a day are published. And if you realize how many of that 3,000 are being published by this text messaging thing. This is a different world. The reading is going to be different. The language is going to be different. The experience is going to be different. And if we, who come from a more traditional background, if we expect that these kids are going to adopt what we do, we're crazy, because they're not. They're going to get some of it. Books are always going to be around, but we are facing a new world in writing and in reading.
I feel bad. It reminds me of my father. My father, in his early 80s, had a very militant sister. Her chin stuck out like this. She taught fourth grade for 100 years. And she came in one day to my father's house, and he's sitting in his corner of the dining room, and my mother's sitting in her corner. We just heated one room in the old house in the wintertime. And they had a good heater in the dining room. And he said, "Lou, how are you doing?" "Oh, Farrell, I feel terrible." "Well, what's the matter?" She said, "Beverly Lane, who was one of her granddaughters, is getting divorced." And they said, "Oh, that's terrible." She said, "Well, that's not all." Said, "She found out her husband is gay." And Daddy said, "She found out what?" And she said, "She found out her husband was gay." She said, "You mean he was real happy?" And she said, "No, Farrell, he was homosexual." And he clapped his hand to his forehead and said, "Oh my God, Mildred, we've lived too damn long." And that's all the way Terry's story makes me feel.
Makes me feel that way too a little bit.
We are lucky to
Lucky
be
to be
alive.
here.
We still understand how things work.
Yeah.
John, just a comment about the young writer or the beginning writer. I think the most common failing is that they haven't read enough. And now we're faced with the problem of digital technology coming at us from every which way. The Chinese coming at every which way with text message books. And here we are just trying to teach them a little bit of Shakespeare and the Bible, which was what Emily said is the only thing we need. We are going to have to cope with globalization of literature, and it'll probably be a strengthening effect. One young man named Ha Jin, who was from China, taught at Emory for a while until he won the National Book Award. And he's gone on to greater and greater things. So our reading is going to change, but I'm hoping that those who want to be writers will read more. That's the most common. When I see a manuscript, it's because they want to be told, "Hey, this is really good." And usually it's not. And some of the doctors are hopeless.
Well, I think we have to develop a new way of teaching all of this. We're dealing with these young people. You just can't deal with them like you did 20, 30 years ago. And I think that the school system have got to seriously consider some revolutionary way of inspiring the love of reading or of writing. And I don't know that we do that today nearly as much as.
Let me tell you about John Stone. John Stone is a cardiologist. He deals in the country of hearts, as he said in the book he wrote. But he started in medical school. He saw the need for it. And he started once a week having portrait seminars in the evenings with students who were interested in it. And my second son was in his class and went to a couple of these seminars and came home and said, "Dad, you have got to come to Atlanta and hear this." But he works with these young people and he reaches them. He doesn't reach all of them. I haven't seen an orthopedist but he really does. And I think he takes a different view from the young people of today than you do or I do. I see an awful lot of good ones. I see an awful lot who still, but as a newspaper man, you're not going to meet the wide, well, I won't say wide, but exactly the same group of people that you do in medicine.
All right,
And we get to them earlier, we get to them sooner, and I think there's great hope for them.
Don't misread me, please, Farrell. But I'm not saying that all this new technology is a ruination of things. I'm simply saying it is going to be a reality, and somehow we have to accept the fact that that reality is there. Oh Lord, I have great faith in it.
Well, I apologize because I was getting a graphic image of you with a long pole saying the end is near.
What I'm trying to say is maybe the beginning is just starting for a new thing.
Bailey, I saw that
They have covered much more eloquently what I was going to say. I was just going to say that though that book Terry was describing, that digital book is very different from the book we love. The book you can smell the pages and feel the weight of it on your chest at night. That book sounds much easier to read, really. Probably has its own life, and you can make it big or small, and so I think maybe people will read more when they have these books. Have a whole library at the click of a button.
well, thank you all very much. And
What did this hour pass?
and I know that all of Georgia has enjoyed listening to all of you. So thank you.
But
You're going to